Good morning, friends. This is CEC-UGC network, and today we are starting a new series on English literature. The title of the series is The Novel in English, and the novel in English is supposed to be that fictional writing which emerged in England and America. And this is different from and distinctive from the Romanian European fiction that also was integrated with it, but we are at the moment in this series focusing upon the novel in English. This will have a number of lectures by a team. I am one of the team, and we will be taking up trends, novels, socio-historical sources, and the theoretical aspects about the English novel, the novel that gave rise to a certain series of thoughts and impressions about life, and all this will be covered under the separate lectures. Today being the first lecture would be on the rise of the novel in English. You know that theoretically speaking, there are times when one particular literary form or genre emerges, takes shape, and that happens over decades and centuries. So far as history is concerned, decades do not mean much. Half centuries and centuries are the beginning points, because when the trend is taking shape, then we are not exactly clear about it. And when I say this, I refer to a new form that is called the novel. Why do I call the new form? This particular way of writing has certain aspects to it. You know that humankind, I don't know where it starts from, which point in history, but humankind on the planet came up, emerged, evolved millions of years ago, and for a long time the language of the human beings was confined to merely expressing crude messages, not more than that. I don't want to go into that aspect of history, but I would refer to the history of the last, let's say, 4,000 or 5,000 years, when stories came into being, when poetry came into being, when music was there as a part of the stories and other things, and one could not separate one from the other at that time. But later on, what happened was that literature in general, and particular forms in particular, they had a kind of distinctness that could be taken as a recognition point. For instance, there would be an epic, that's a form, and people gather and they listen to the bard. The bard is singing, speaking, making comments, entertaining the audience. Then came drama. In the drama, some actors appeared on the stage and they started speaking dialogues, and they made the people think that there was a situation in which those dialogues meant specific things. These are old forms. they are as old as 3,000 years, 2,000 years, and these things have continued in, of course, changed form. When I say the novel is a new form, what I mean is that it has happened just recently. Let's say 300 years ago, is the period in England and also in Europe when novels came into being. There were no novels earlier. That's why this topic of today, which is called the rise of the English novel in English, this has become relevant. We can identify when the novel come into being, and the rise happened at a time when there were specific historical and social circumstances. People demanded something. Writers were inspired by certain issues. Problems of a specific kind were confronted by the writers, and they wanted to include them in their realm of imagination. They would think about them. They would say something about those problems. Sometimes they would directly or indirectly suggest solutions to those problems, or they would raise further questions about the issues, so that issues got problematized. Problematizing of the issue is an important part of novel writing or literary writing. Why? Because when you are shown something, then you mean the reader. When I read something new, when I'm shown something on the stage which is new, then I set thinking. I start thinking. And the novel initially was presented to the audience, and the audience started thinking about what was presented in the novel. So thinking also is an important part of the evolution of a literary form. So not that the writer knows everything. The writer may be wondering about what's happening around him, and then he wants to share with the audience the sense of wonder. And if he is able to make the people wonder, make the people ask questions, make the people, within quotes, guessing, feeling confused, then that confusion is the beginning of entering an area and making sense of it much better later. So so novel that way has a kind of problematic all the time, right from the beginning itself. In fact, the origin of the novel can be seen in a kind of problematic. And that problematic emerges, I'm using this word specifically in theoretical terms, a big problem that takes you into its fold and waits for an answer from you. And if you don't have the answer, then certain other people start wondering about it, and then the problem has a kind of shape which was not initially there. It was a seed form, but later on the problem became more of a problem. That's a problematic. It has its own structure, it has its own questions, it has its own scopes, and all those things are visualized by both the writer and the reader. So it's a kind of a big question. So I would generally say that is the problematic of a novel. So when would novel then have its inkling itself that it's an important thing? When does the writer think that he or she has to write a novel? These are the questions that come to me, and they reach me, and they might also reach you. You might also start thinking that novels are not there, let's say, in the 15th century, but they are there in the 18th century. So one can always ask as to why. What was there in the 18th century that the novel came into being? So this is the question that I'm thinking about, and I hope that the right kind of curiosity would be there now in your mind. So I would say that I just take you to the literary sources first. There might be sources in history. I refer to them indirectly. There might be sources in society. Society was of a particular kind and would give rise to a new way of writing, and that was the fictional writing or the novel writing. But I'm not going to that for the moment. Maybe towards the end of the discussion, I would also go into the society and the history of the sources where the novel was influenced, was affected by those developments. So let's first look at the literary sources. I just first refer to Travels of Sir John Mandeville, and this is probably published in 1375. 1375, more than 600 years, and in England. So there is a title which is the Travels of Sir John Mandeville. The writer is not clearly identified, but this book is available. And who is Sir John Mandeville? Well, he is a traveller, and he is travelling from one place to another. That is the identity of the character, that he is going from one place to another. Why do people go from one place to another? Why don't they remain fixed at one point where they are born, and they just live in that village, they live in the small town, they are there, they spend their time, become young, become old, die, give rise to a larger family, all those things. That itself is a question that we should ask ourselves. Why do we feel the need of traveling? And the simple answer is that the world in which we live, the area where we reside, that area sometimes becomes dull. So we want to know as to what's happening beyond 10 miles of where we live. So we go there, and then we realize that the habits of the people living there are somewhat different from our habits. So we start then thinking about which habits are superior, inferior, different, are more entertaining, less entertaining, are they worth leaving or are they worth adopting? All these questions occur, and we are filled with those questions. So travel is a very educative kind of an experience. If you are stuck to one place, then you somehow lose interest in the surroundings, and you become bored, and you become irritable. You are all the time annoyed. You feel heavy because nothing interests you in the area that you have inhabited. But then there is an option. The option is that you leave that area, you go elsewhere, and when you go elsewhere, then you are literally displaced from that place. Now there will be challenges. Now you can't take anything for granted. Maybe the person who believed in friendship in one's own village will not see that kind of friendship elsewhere, and then one will ask questions as to why is it that back home things were so simple, and now at a new place all people suspect you for being somebody else, for being a harmful person, and you feel uneasy. And that unease is both negative and positive. It rattles you. It disturbs your peace of mind. At the same time, it activates the mind. The mind, now is uncertain, and that uncertainty compels the mind to think regularly. So that is the fun of traveling. You go elsewhere, and when you come back, after maybe you spent 3 or 4 years elsewhere, and then you came back, what will happen then? Then you will cause ripples in the place that you left earlier, because people will come to you. They will swarm to you. They will just come near you and ask a large number of questions. Where did you go? What did you find? Was it different? Was it new? Was it nice? Were you happy? All those questions, because they have been your friends all your life. And then you start telling them the account. This particular thing, let's say, started in England around the time of Renaissance. I won't go into why at that point of time these things happened. That can be the topic maybe later. But then people started traveling in the Renaissance period. They were not happy with their own village. They were not happy with the small town which was close to their village. They wanted to just move around and see the world for what it was. So 1375, this text emerges, and this is read very, very widely with great interest. Then you have another book called Morte, dArthur, and this is by Thomas Malory. This also has characters, and there's some kind of newness is involved in the dictum, and there are families, then there are heroes, then there are fights, then there are tales, then there are narratives, and all those tales and narratives, they entertain you. And entertaining means that they once again excite your imagination, and you are told something new, and you start thinking about them. The same thing happens in the case of the third book that I take you to, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. This is generally in the course of most universities for BA in English and MA in English. And generally we start our reading of literature, English literature, with this author who was there in the 14th century. And he has a whole book. The book was not complete, but then in whatever form is there, it's a good long book, and it's called Canterbury Tales. Now imagine the word tales here. There are stories. The stories mean that there are characters. Characters mean that they are surrounded by certain questions. They are surrounded by certain problems, and they are sharing those problems with the others. How many characters are these? Because you have read the Canterbury Tales, at least the prologue to the Canterbury Tales. All of us would have read if we are students of literature. The interesting thing about this particular book that Chaucer wrote in the 14th century, the interesting thing about this is that there are a large number of characters here, and they get together at one place, and they are going on holy pilgrimage, and they will be traveling from London to Canterbury. And traveling in those days takes days, if not weeks, and so these people will be going towards Canterbury. They are riding horses. They'll come back, and they have to spend time together. And the best way to spend time together is to tell one another tales, stories. And these tales then are collected by and woven into a pattern by Chaucer. And they gave they gave that pleasure of adding to somebody's imagination. You imagine a character, you imagine a new village, you imagine a new surrounding, the issues of religion, the issues of fashion, the issues of eating, the issues of fighting, the issues of making friends, and still more importantly, the issue of learning and teaching. So these actual characters are visualized by Chaucer, and then he is telling the tales. How come that I am referring to a book of poems and I call it something having a seed of a novel? Well, you can ask this question from yourself also, whether there are stories in it, whether they have a beginning and an end, whether they have characters, whether those characters learn. You start asking these questions and you reach the conclusion, yes, these tales have the seed of the novel in them, because they are long stories, or together, all the stories put together, what the number of the stories would be about 100. Then together these stories start telling about the social life, the historical life of England through the writer's imagination, and that's what the novel does. So Chaucer is not writing a novel. Chaucer doesn't even know what a novel is. He is merely telling people stories in verse. So it's a poetry. But then as one realizes that the stories also have references to society of the time, and that they are not merely poems to be sung or poems to be recited. Therefore, this has drama, this has poetry, this also has the element of narrative. Narrative means narrating a tale by one person to another. So maybe the novel would take inspiration from these narratives of the past, and when somebody would read these things, let's say in the 16th century, in the 17th century, then someday one would start thinking of prolonging the story, adding something to it, making it more readable, making it more relevant to one's own time. One doesn't know. I can only guess that these stories would have given some kind of a suggestion to the writer to experiment about telling the story further. So I would say that these have seeds of literature. Maybe the origin of the English novel is in books like this. From there I go to things nearer us, because the three books that I refer to, they all belong to the pre-15th century period, 14th century period in fact. But now let's think of the 16th century. At the end of the 16th century, there is a book that we have, it's called The Unfortunate Traveller, and it's written by Thomas Nash, and the publication of this book is 1594. Now imagine, all of us are students of literature. 1594 is a very important year for us. Shakespeare is not only alive, but he is also kicking. He is emerging as a great dramatist in 1594. He has started writing comedies and is moving towards writing histories now. But then in Shakespeare's time, who was a dramatist? In Shakespeare's time, there is a person called Thomas Nash, and he is writing about a traveller. Now see the catch. It's an unfortunate traveller. What does it mean? And the moment you see the title, you start reading it. Let's find out why he is unfortunate. And somebody is unfortunate not because of one's own self, but because at the right time something wrong happened, and the person could not enjoy the fruits of his expectations, his labor, and therefore he was unfortunate. He missed the chance. Then this is one, and this will straight away attract the reader towards the text, and the reader would like to know more and more as to why this traveller who travelled from one place to another was not lucky enough. So there is a story. The story is inherent in the title itself, that the person went to some place, and the circumstances in which he was placed were not the happy circumstances, and he lost his chances, missed his chances. Okay, there is a whole story in it. Then the second book that I refer to in this particular category, because these are very close to the novel as we understand the term today. The second book is, this is Aphra Behn's Orunoko. It's a strange name, and it's not a European name, you can say. It's not even an Indian name. It's not an Asian name. What kind of a name is this? This is very close to the African kind of names. And what is Aphra Behn interested in for? By writing about a person who is of the African origin. And that itself is associated with curiosity about Africa. in Europe. That curiosity is there, and which means Ephra Behn is writing. And in this case, for the first time, you have, we have with us a writer who is a woman. So Ephra Behn, in the late 17th century, is writing a novel. The novel is about an African, and imagine a woman in the 17th century England is writing a novel about a character who comes from Africa or who has been seen in Africa, and she considers him worthwhile enough to write a story about. So that shows that it serves both the purposes. It's a kind of a travel involved in it. That travel is that one goes to Africa and sees, one goes to another country and sees that this African has perhaps traveled there. Either way, the traveler is involved. So circumstances change with the travel, and that gives scope to the narrative to enrich itself. So we once again, the travel, the mysterious, the unexpected, the uncertain, that is the element that makes us interested in something that we would like to know. So these things occur in the late 16th century, the first book, and the second book is in the late 17th century. There is a gap of 70-80 years between them. So people have been in the meantime reading other books also about other countries. England is all the time interested in the neighbors. They would be thinking about France, they would be thinking about Italy, about Spain, and even beyond the European borders. And the more they know, the better knowledge they have. And I'm indirectly telling you, telling myself that novel has this important characteristic of telling us what is happening in places which are far off, with people who are not known to us directly. So that way, novel is a very educative form, and it's very near us. We are in the 21st century now, and these books that I referred to, barring the last three books which were in the 13th, 14th centuries, these books are 16th and 17th century, and we are getting closer to ourselves. And one can say that the novels that I referred to you so far are the novels which are getting more and more close to the social reality. Now they are not as much imaginative as they are real. Already you have an actual person called Orinoco, who comes from Africa, and people at that point of time had known Africa and Africans, and slave trade was going on. It started at that point of time, and it was easy enough for the Europeans with the kind of mental skills they have to entangle these people to work for them. And that Orinoco, even though he's a noble, he belongs to the nobility there in Africa, he'll be taken as a slave in this particular story. So side by side with travels, history also is being revealed through the reading of the novels. But anyway, let's go further than this, and then we go to actual novels that are recognized today as novels, even though in their own time they may not have been considered novels in the sense in which we know the term today. I refer to Daniel Defoe and Henry Fielding in early 18th century. 18th century is very close to Orinoco, which was published in 1688, and which is the end of the 17th century. And then we have Daniel Defoe and Henry Fielding, who are early 18th century writers. They are born at that time, and very soon, when they are in their late 20s or 30s, they will start writing novels, and these novels will finally be far away from where the origin happened, and nearer to us, where we are facing our own problems. So that is what the origin of the novel suggests to us. And this kind of a novel is going to change in direction, in understanding, in interest, in engagement.